The Underground Railroad was a very important event in history, but it was not underground and it had nothing to do with trains or railroads. It was a well-planned group of secret routes, passages, and safe houses that were used by African American slaves to travel from south, where slavery existed, to the north, where it did not, in order to receive freedom. One of the most famous leaders, Harriet Tubman, played a very important part in the history of the Underground Railroad. Tubman, a slave herself, in Dorchester County, Maryland, was able to free herself by escaping to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She returned to the South 19 different times to free more slaves through the Underground Railroad. Tubman ended up freeing 300 slaves in all. The Underground Railroad workers who ended up doing the most were the Northern free blacks. They received very little or even no support from the Northern abolitionists. The Underground Railroad played a big part in history because it helped free many runaway slaves into the North, where slavery did not exist. The railroad formed in the early 1820s. It lasted around 40 years until the 1860s. According to the present-day internet, it was formed in the early 1820s and stayed active until about 1850 or 1860. One estimate states that by around 1860, nearly 100,000 slaves had escaped from the South through the Underground Railroad. To keep the risk of getting caught behind them, workers on the Underground Railroad were to only know their section, meaning their area of responsibility. They were not to know any other parts of how the Underground Railroad worked. The leaders or conductors led the slaves from station to station. A leader or conductor also had to sometimes act as if they were a slave to be able to go into the plantations, while also trying not to get caught as a part of the railroad. Two most famous conductors were Harriet Tubman and William Still, an abolitionist from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Sometimes slaves escaped by boat or by train. Most times the slaves escaped by foot or by wagon. Most of the groups varied between 1 to 3 slaves, but depending on the amount of slaves, they could have been more larger groups. One abolitionist by the name of Charles Turner Torrey and his men had organized one of the best Underground Railroad lines. It went from Washington to Baltimore to Philadelphia to Albany, New York. He rented horses and wagons. They were able to carry about 15 to 20 slaves at a time. The experience was said to be very difficult with women and children. The children were said to be hard to keep quiet in a large group. The downfall with helping women escape was that some feared what would happen if they were to be caught. Charles Turner Torrey helped free around 400 slaves himself. People who were part of the Underground Railroad had made up their own terminology. This terminology alerted the escaped slaves and the Underground Railroad workers to safe homes and other codes that kept the railroad a secret. The people who showed the slaves where to go were called conductors, or leaders. Tracks were routes fixed by abolitionists. Places where slaves could go feast and rest safely were called safe houses or stations. Freed slaves, also known as cargo, freight, or passengers. Freedom trails were the routes of the Underground Railroad. Heaven, or the Promised Land, were considered the northern states. On the Underground Railroad had to deal with their own difficulties during this process as well. Say, for example, an abolitionist in the North were to be caught helping a slave escape. They would have been fined a large amount of money, especially for this time period. A former slave by the name of Stephen Myers wrote in his very own newspaper, the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate, about his journey helping others into the North to escape slavery. Myers became one of the most important and well-known conductors from upstate New York. The most dangerous action that had probably scared most abolitionists was the fact that if they were to get caught helping the fugitives escape in a southern state, they were to be imprisoned at minimum. They could even possibly be whipped or hung. If white men were caught performing the duty of helping the fugitives escape, their punishment was way worse than the white women. At minimum, both men and women could receive jail time. But the most horrible punishments could vary from the action of being whipped many times to being burned, to ashes, or hung. At one point, there was an action named the Reverse Underground Railroad. The Reverse Underground Railroad took place in the northern states bordering the Ohio River. The activity included black men and women, whom were enslaved or not, being taken into a place and hidden, as you can say kidnapped, and put into barns or other buildings. Then they were to be shipped back down south and sold as slaves. The state of Delaware, which had one of the most largest amounts in the population of free blacks, had become the state with the biggest group to participate in the Reverse Underground Railroad. It was also named to be one of the most organized groups in U.S. history. In 1850, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act forced the Underground Railroad to extend north. Freed slaves can now be forced back to the south. Canada now became the final stop for freed slaves. More than 100,000 slaves had escaped to Canada, with most ending up in Quebec and Nova Scotia. The Underground Railroad had many sites for the fugitives. There were 2 sites in Kansas, 4 in Iowa, 1 in Wisconsin, 5 in Illinois, and 2 in Michigan. There were 5 in Indiana and many in Ohio. There were also 6 sites in Pennsylvania. There were also many sites for the following states: New York, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Florida, Colorado, Nebraska, Kentucky, and the District of Columbia. In 1861, the Civil War began. This led to the beginning of the end of the Underground Railroad. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the now Confederate States. In 1865, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution abolished slavery in the U.S. This act officially ended the Underground Railroad. On the legislation passed in 1990, the Congress passed H.R. 1635, in which that time's President Bill Clinton had signed. The law he signed authorized the United States National Park Service. The project allowed the Underground Railroad sites to be preserved and cleaned so that the present-day people can see them. The National Service also holds an annual conference that gives information about the Underground Railroad sites every year around the months of May or June.